You know the Tudors. The name itself carries weight. Images of Henry VIII with his 6 wives, Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, and the dramatic rise and fall of Anne Boleyn. Their stories dominate the stage of history. Loud, colorful, unforgettable. But behind these shining figures, there were others, women of the same bloodline, daughters, nieces, and sisters, whose names have slipped like shadows into the margins. They were born into palaces, wrapped in silk, but their fates were written quietly, their lives erased, ignored, or forgotten. Imagine a child princess, promised once to foreign kings, raised with tutors, music, and hope, but later pushed aside when politics shifted. Or a young woman of royal blood, who lived not in splendor, but in fear, knowing that the crown she touched could also mean death. These women walked the same halls as queens and kings, yet left no statues, no songs, no legends. Why do we not remember them? Was it because they did not wear the crown? Because they lived quietly, without wars, without executions? Or perhaps because their stories did not serve the grand narratives of power? Their voices were folded away, like letters locked in a chest, waiting to be read centuries later. Tonight, we open that chest. We search for the erased daughters of the Tudor dynasty, the women whose stories are delicate threads in the vast tapestry of history. Each name is a whisper, each life a reminder that history is not only made by kings and queens, but also by those who were silenced. So, as the world falls quiet, let us step gently into their world, beyond the noise of battles and crowns, into the silent corridors where forgotten royal women once lived. Here their stories breathe again, softly, patiently, like echoes waiting to be heard. When we think of the Tudors, we think of a dynasty painted in bold strokes, kings and queens who shaped the destiny of England, and in doing so, etched themselves into the world's collective memory. The Tudor line begins in 1485, with Henry VII's unlikely victory at the Battle of Bosworth. His triumph ended the Wars of the Roses, a brutal conflict that had divided noble families for decades. Henry's marriage to Elizabeth of York united the red rose and the white, and symbolized peace, stability, and a new beginning. From that moment, the Tudors became more than rulers, they became symbols. Their lives were recorded in portraits, chronicles, and legends. Henry VIII's towering figure, his 6 wives, and his desperate quest for a son. Edward VI, frail and short-lived. Mary I, remembered for fire and fear. And Elizabeth I, the last Tudor, the Virgin Queen, whose reign glittered with drama and power. But if history is a grand stage, not every actor is given a voice. In the shadows of this dynasty were daughters, sisters, and nieces. Their names were once spoken at court, written in letters, or whispered in alliances. Yet, over time, they faded from view. Some were born with the promise of crowns, but lived without them. Others were pawns in games of marriage and diplomacy. Their childhoods spent in gilded nurseries, their futures traded like coins across Europe. A few died young, their lives barely recorded, while others survived, yet lived quietly, almost invisibly, within the shifting tides of Tudor politics. It is not that these women lacked significance. Quite the opposite. They carried the bloodline that mattered most. The Tudor name, but in a world ruled by patriarchs, and by stories that valued power, victory, and spectacle. Their quieter contributions were brushed aside. Think for a moment of Margaret Tudor, elder sister to Henry VIII, sent away at just 13 to marry James IV of Scotland. She walked into a foreign court, a girl turned queen. She gave birth to the Stuart line, the very blood that would one day unite Scotland and England under one crown. Yet, in comparison to her brother Henry, her story is barely remembered. Or consider Mary Tudor, known as Mary Rose, the younger sister of Henry VIII, celebrated for her beauty, admired in her youth. She was married off to an aging king of France, a political alliance more than a romance. But when widowed, she chose love instead of duty, marrying Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk, against her brother's will. Her courage shaped her legacy, yet history whispers her name only faintly. And beyond these sisters, there were daughters who were not crowned queens. Elizabeth of York's other children, Henry VIII's nieces, and women who stood at the fragile edge of succession, sometimes too close to power for their own safety. These women are not the Tudors we see in movies or textbooks. They are not the figures whose portraits hang in galleries. Instead, they are footnotes, mentioned once, perhaps twice, before the page turns. But imagine their lives, walking through stone halls, embroidered gowns brushing the cold floors, hearing the same court music, the same prayers, the same fears of treachery and downfall. They lived within the drama of the Tudors, but they were not allowed to control the story, and yet their shadows linger. Without Margaret Tudor, there would be no James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. Without Mary Tudor, the bloodline of Suffolk would not have stood dangerously close to the throne during Elizabeth's reign. Without the forgotten daughters, the tapestry of Tudor history is incomplete. To remember the Tudors only through Henry VIII and Elizabeth I is like looking at a painting with half the colors erased. The brilliance remains, but the depth is gone. So let us pause. Let us look not at the blazing sun of the Tudor dynasty, but at the softer light of its hidden stars. For in their quiet lives, in their erased stories, we may find truths that history forgot. The Tudor court was often remembered in history as a theatre of grand politics, glittering banquets, and solemn ceremonies. But if you lean in closer, past the noise of councils and coronations, you might begin to hear softer sounds, the quieter rhythms of a woman's day within the palace walls. Each morning began long before the court truly stirred. Servants entered with candles, their light flickering against the carved wooden panels. A lady would rise slowly from her bed, layered with heavy velvet curtains meant to guard against the draught. She would be helped into her garments. Not one dress, but layers upon layers. A linen shift first, then petticoats, then bodices tightened by skilled hands. It was a daily ritual, one that spoke of patience and propriety rather than freedom. Her hair, brushed and braided with care, was then bound beneath a hood or cap, while letters, tied in ribbon, might be delivered to her hand. Some women opened them eagerly, seeking news from distant kin. Others would instead prefer to let a musician play quietly in the chamber, a lute, perhaps, the soft notes lingering in the air like a whispered prayer. The day unfolded in measured steps. Walks in the gardens when weather allowed, the scent of roses drifting in summer air, or gatherings in richly adorned halls, where embroidered tapestries muffled the echoes of voices. But it was, in the evenings, when the great banquets ended and the courtiers' chatter fell away, that these women often found their most tender hours. Picture a fire glowing in the hearth, its warmth softening the chill of the stone walls. a lady seated with her embroidery frame, stitching flowers into cloth, as if holding on to the blooms of summer even in winter. Another, curled in a chair with a book of psalms or romances, her lips moving in silent reading. And beyond the grandeur and the politics, there were still moments of laughter, perhaps a sister's teasing remark, or a mother's proud glance at a child. These fragile threads of intimacy, often overlooked by history, were the fabric of their lives. Behind the crowns and titles, behind the solemn portraits painted with stiff dignity, there was humanity, soft, quiet, sometimes lonely, yet also deeply alive. Mary Tudor, the younger sister of Henry VIII. She was born into privilege, into the golden halls of the Tudor court. Yet her life was marked not only by splendor, but by the deep ache of choices forced upon her. At 16, Mary was known as one of the most beautiful princesses in Europe, fair, graceful, with the charm of youth and the wit of her father's line. But beauty in a princess was never only her own. It was a coin to be spent in the currency of dynastic ambition. Henry VIII, her brother, arranged for her to marry Louis XII of France. He was more than 3 decades her senior, an aging king with frail health. Mary, so young, was sent away across the Channel, leaving behind the gardens of Greenwich, the River Thames, the scent of English roses she loved so dearly. Imagine the young girl, dressed in silks, sailing away from the land of her childhood, the shores of England fading into mist, her heart heavy with dread, but her face composed as befit a princess. In France, she was queen, but not in joy, for within a year her husband was dead, and she was left a widow at only 17. It was then, in her grief, that she made a daring choice. She turned not toward another political match, but toward love. Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, her brother's closest friend. He was no foreign king, no mighty ruler, but he was the man she loved. Their union caused scandal. For a royal princess to marry without her brother's consent was a dangerous defiance. But Mary was bold. She had lived the cold splendor of a loveless crown, and she refused to repeat it. In secret, she and Brandon wed, choosing the risk of royal wrath over the certainty of emptiness. Henry VIII, furious at first, demanded heavy fines and concessions. Yet in the end, he forgave them, for Charles was his companion, and Mary his beloved sister. And so, Mary Tudor lived the rest of her life, not as a queen consort of France, but as Duchess of Suffolk, a woman who had tasted duty and then chosen freedom. Her home in Suffolk became a place of relative peace. She bore children, presided over her household, and found joy in the ordinary rhythm of love and family. Still, history remembered her less than she deserved. She is often a side note, a sister of a great king, a fleeting queen of France. But within her story lies something rare, a princess who defied the iron grip of politics, and for once was allowed to keep her heart. Mary Tudor's life reminds us that even in the age of dynasties and alliances, love sometimes found its way through the cracks. Her story is not one of battles or crowns, but of a young woman who longed for roses, for home, for freedom, and who, for a time, found them. Margaret Douglas, niece of Henry VIII, cousin to Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I. A woman of noble birth whose life was written in the margins of great power. Her mother was Margaret Tudor, Queen of Scotland, elder sister of Henry VIII. Her father was the Scottish nobleman Archibald Douglas. From the moment of her birth, Margaret stood at a crossroads between two kingdoms, Two crowns, two destinies. She grew up within the English court, close to her uncle Henry, educated in the refinement of poetry, letters, and religion. She was clever, graceful, ambitious, but her position was perilous. For a woman of royal blood, every glance, every word, every bond could be seen as a threat or a promise. Margaret's life was scarred by her choices of love. Twice she was imprisoned for marriages or engagements that displeased the king. Once, for falling in love with Lord Thomas Howard, uncle to Anne Boleyn. Their secret betrothal enraged Henry, for such a match, without his blessing, threatened dynastic stability. Thomas was sent to the Tower, where he died. Margaret was imprisoned in disgrace. Later, again, she was entangled in romances the crown forbade. Her heart seemed always to guide her toward danger, and each time the price was confinement. Her life became a pattern of bright hopes, followed by the dim silence of captivity. Within the walls of her prison chambers, Margaret endured. She read poetry, she wrote letters. In the solitude of stone and silence, her words were her companions. She did not rebel, she did not storm against her fate. Instead, she waited, endured, and dreamed. But Margaret was not only a lover of poetry, she was also a player in politics. Her son, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, would one day wed Mary, Queen of Scots. Through that union, Margaret's bloodline flowed directly into the future Stuart dynasty, the very line that would unite the crowns of England and Scotland under James VI and I. It is a strange irony. Margaret, who spent her life confined, distrusted, punished for her choices, became, through her descendants, one of the most important figures in Britain's royal history. Yet history does not celebrate her. She remains in the shadows, her life remembered as scandal, as missteps, as punishments, rarely as the quiet endurance of a woman caught between the crushing gears of politics and the beating of her own heart. Margaret Douglas lived neither as queen nor as commoner, but as something in between. Too royal to be free, not royal enough to be safe. She is a reminder that the Tudor story was not only written by kings and queens, but also by women, who lived in the margins, whose lives shaped dynasties even as their own happiness was denied. Her story closes with a kind of bitter triumph. She never wore a crown, but her grandson would unite them. Her sacrifices, her losses, her tears, all became the quiet foundation for a dynasty that changed Britain forever. Elizabeth of York is a name that many know only faintly, perhaps as the mother of Henry VIII, or as the woman whose marriage ended the Wars of the Roses. But behind the pageantry of her title lay a life that reveals a quieter, steadier kind of strength, one that was never loud, yet shaped the very destiny of England. She was born into turmoil, daughter of Edward IV, a king whose throne was never entirely secure. As a child, she knew the grandeur of court, and then the shadow of loss. Her father died when she was still young, and her brothers, the princes, in the Tower vanished into the silence of history. Elizabeth, still only a girl, must have carried the sorrow of that mystery, the ache of knowing her brothers were gone while she survived. Her fate was sealed in politics. The battle between Lancaster and York, raging for decades, ended when Henry Tudor claimed victory at Bosworth. To strengthen his crown, Henry married Elizabeth of York, uniting the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York into the emblem we know today, the Tudor rose. It was a marriage of politics, but by all accounts, it became a marriage of quiet affection. Elizabeth was no fiery queen, no voice of rebellion, Instead, she offered calm, stability, and a gentleness that complemented Henry's often cautious, calculating nature. Her role was not to command armies or to defy courts, but to provide the one thing the kingdom needed most: peace. Through her presence, she embodied reconciliation. Her very immature, Yorkist princess by birth, a Tudor queen by marriage, stood as a symbol that England's wounds could finally heal. In her private life, Elizabeth's joys were simple. She found comfort in her children, in the laughter of the nursery, in the small, fleeting happiness of family. She loved her daughters and sons, perhaps with a deeper tenderness born of her own childhood losses. And though she was queen, she was also a mother who knew grief. Her firstborn son, Arthur, heir to the throne, died young, leaving Henry VIII to inherit a destiny he was never meant to carry alone. Elizabeth bore her sorrows quietly, with dignity. Unlike so many figures of the Tudor court, she did not rage or scheme. Her silence was not weakness, it was strength. By stepping back from the theatre of power, she gave stability to those around her. In an age when voices often rose with ambition, Elizabeth's calm endurance was her contribution. When she died in 1503, still only in her 30s, England mourned her deeply. Her people remembered her not as a queen who shouted commands, but as one who brought peace simply by being there. Even Henry VII, a man often guarded in his emotions, was said to be stricken with grief at her passing. Elizabeth of York lives on less in the chronicles of battles and more in the lineage she left behind. Through her, the Tudors carried legitimacy. Through her, the red and white roses became one. Through her quiet presence, England found stability after years of bloodshed. Her story whispers to us that not all power is loud. Sometimes it lies in patience, in endurance, in love given quietly but steadfastly. Elizabeth was, in truth, a queen who spoke softly, yet her silence shaped a dynasty. Beyond the great names of queens and princesses, there were others. Women who lived within the Tudor shadow, whose stories are rarely told, but whose lives revealed the fragility and humanity of the age. One such figure was Lady Mary Grey, youngest sister of Lady Jane Grey, the tragic 9 Days Queen. Unlike her elder sisters, Mary was small of stature, described as frail, with a crooked spine. Yet beneath her physical limitations lay a spirit that longed for the freedom to love. Mary defied expectations by marrying for affection, not politics. She wed Thomas Keyes, a man far beneath her station, in a match that shocked the court. For her daring, she was placed under house arrest, condemned not for treason but for daring to follow her heart. While others shaped kingdoms, Mary lived out her years in quiet confinement, her love story remembered not as triumph but as scandal. Yet in truth, she was another Tudor woman who chose the risky path of personal happiness over dynastic duty. And then there were the women who served in silence, the ladies-in-waiting who moved like shadows through the chambers of queens. These women held secrets no chronicler ever recorded. They comforted queens in childbirth. They wept with them in grief. They carried whispered messages through candlelit corridors. A lady-in-waiting might stand at the edge of history as a silent witness. She would see the tears of Catherine of Aragon as she realized Henry VIII would set her aside. She would hold Anne Boleyn's jewels as the Queen walked to a final hour. She would watch Elizabeth I, even as a young princess, trembling under the suspicion of treason. Their names are not always remembered. Few monuments bear their likeness. Yet without them, the Tudor world could not have functioned. They were the keepers of daily life, the ones who held together the fragile fabric of court, even as kings and queens tore it apart with ambition. These forgotten women remind us of a truth, that history is not only the story of rulers, but of those who stood beside them, who suffered in silence, who loved quietly, who endured patiently. From Mary Tudor, who chose love over politics, to Margaret Douglas, trapped between dynasties, to Elizabeth of York, whose silence gave strength, and finally to Mary Grey and the nameless ladies of the court. Each reveals another side of Tudor history, one written not in proclamations or victories, but in whispered choices, private sorrows, and fragile hopes. They were daughters, sisters, wives, confidants, some royal, some not. And though history has often pushed them into the margins, their stories survive in fragments, reminding us that even the quietest voices left echoes. When we think of the Tudors, it is so easy to picture the crowns, the pageantry, the loud figures who dominated the chronicles. Henry VIII with his thunderous decrees, Elizabeth I with her commanding speeches, but just beneath those loud echoes, there is another layer, softer, quieter, yet equally lasting. The forgotten royal women, the daughters, the sisters, the mothers left behind a different kind of inheritance. Not one written in laws or sealed by armies, but one passed gently through the fabric of family, tradition, and memory. Mary Tudor, who defied a king for love, left behind a lesson about courage of the heart. Margaret Douglas, caught between rival factions, showed how resilience could bloom even in confinement. Elizabeth of York, through her steady presence, wove peace into a nation torn apart by war. And Mary Grey, though frail and overshadowed, dared to choose affection over ambition. Their influence was not measured in victories, it was felt in how people remembered them, whispered in stories of defiance, compassion, and endurance. The kind of legacy that cannot be weighed in gold or written in treaties, but still lingers like a soft fragrance long after the roses have faded. Through them, diplomacy took on a gentler shape. In their hands, letters became bridges, poems became threads of connection, and quiet gestures soothed wounds that swords could not. They embodied the softer values, art, poetry, loyalty, patience that allowed dynasties not only to survive, but to endure with grace. We might not see their names carved into great monuments, yet their touch lingers in the arts, in the way poetry blossomed at court, in the way children of future rulers carried their mothers' temperaments. Their legacy is invisible, yes, but not absent. It lives on in the undercurrents of culture, in the rhythm of songs, in the traditions passed down gently from one generation to the next. Even silence was part of their gift. Elizabeth of York's quiet acceptance taught a kingdom that peace could be stronger than ambition. Mary Grey's hidden years remind us that love can be an act of rebellion, even when unseen. In these ways, their lives became more than just personal stories. They became subtle forces shaping the soul of Tudor England. And so, the invisible heritage of these women is not lost to time. It exists in the unseen roots of history, the kind of roots that nourish from below, holding the soil together, even when no one notices. And what about us, listening centuries later, in a world so different, yet still so familiar in its struggles? These women remind us that strength does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it stays hidden behind duty or cloaked in patience, yet it is no less real. In our modern lives, we too often celebrate the loud achievements, the promotions, the victories, the public triumphs. But what about the quiet contributions, the late-night care of a parent, the kindness of a friend who listens, the unseen effort of someone who holds a family, a workplace, a community together? Like the Tudor women, these acts rarely make headlines, but they are the threads that keep the fabric from unraveling. They are the diplomacy of everyday life, the poetry written not with ink, but with patience, love, and presence. Perhaps that is why their stories matter still. For in them, we see a reflection of ourselves. We may not wear crowns, nor walk palace corridors, yet we all know the weight of choices unseen, the sacrifice unspoken, the love given quietly. Mary Tudor's longing for freedom, Margaret Douglas's struggles with loyalty, Elizabeth of York's silent strength, Mary Grey's defiance of convention. Each of these stories resonates because they mirror the hidden battles we fight today. The battles between duty and desire, between silence and expression, between being overlooked and knowing one's true worth. History often forgets the quiet ones, yet without them there would be no balance, no peace, no foundation for the louder voices to stand upon. And so it is with us. Our quiet acts, whether seen or unseen, are not wasted. They ripple outward in ways we cannot measure. As you drift into rest, perhaps you carry the memory of these forgotten women with you, not as distant figures in dusty books, but as companions of spirit, reminders that even the faintest whispers leave echoes, that the unseen has power, that silence itself can shape destiny. And so, tonight, as history folds gently into dreams, remember the daughters erased from chronicles, the queens whose words were never written, the sisters who loved, who lost, who endured. Their voices may be hushed, but they are not gone. They remain, always, as part of the quiet heartbeat of history. And perhaps, the greatest surprise of all, is that these women were never fully erased. Though their names rarely appear in bold letters of chronicles, their presence lingers quietly, like soft shadows on the edge of history. Mary Tudor lives on in a faded line from a Spanish court diary, where a scribe noted her laughter, bright even in exile. Margaret Douglas still breathes through a hidden poem, unsigned, but carrying her rhythm, her longing, her fire. Elizabeth of York gazes from the corner of a painting in a chapel, her hands folded, her expression serene, half forgotten yet still watching. And Mary Grey endures in a letter not addressed to her, but speaking of her love, whispered through another's words, tiny fragments, scattered like dust. Yet together, they remind us that the forgotten are never truly gone. They survive in margins, in brushstrokes, in the spaces between official records, waiting for patient eyes to find them. And so, perhaps the best way to keep them alive is not through monuments of stone nor statues in marble, but through the act we are sharing now, by telling their stories, gently, slowly, once more. For as long as we whisper their names into the night, they will never fade. They will live in us, in memory, in story, forever.